The fluorescent lights of Sterling Financial hummed their monotonous tune as Chen stared at his computer screen, watching Bitcoin's price hover around $3,000. His fingers hesitated over the buy button while the morning chatter of his colleagues filled the open office space behind him. The November air outside Denver's downtown district carried the promise of an early winter, but inside the sterile corporate environment, seasons meant nothing more than quarterly reports and performance reviews. Marcus had spent weeks researching, reading white papers until his eyes burned, watching YouTube videos of developers explaining blockchain technology to audiences who seemed to understand something he desperately wanted to grasp. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him this opportunity, a steady job at a respectable financial firm, a path toward the American dream they had chased when they left Taiwan 30 years ago. Yet something deep in his gut told him that this path, safe as it seemed, might not be enough anymore. The conversation at the coffee machine grew louder, and Marcus caught fragments about weekend plans and stock picks. David Thompson, his direct supervisor, was holding court as usual, his booming voice carrying across the floor as he explained why traditional investments were the only sensible choice for serious professionals. David had made it clear from Marcus's first day that he expected his team to think conventionally, to color within the lines, to never rock the boat that had served Sterling Financial well for over 4 decades. Marcus glanced around the office, taking in the sea of navy suits and conservative ties, the framed certificates on oak-paneled walls, the leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in years. Everyone here looked like they belonged. Tall, confident, speaking in acronyms and industry jargon that rolled off their tongues like native language. He thought about his modest apartment across town, his used Honda Civic in the parking garage, his lunch packed in a brown bag while others ordered from expensive restaurants downtown. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, asking if he was eating enough, if he was making friends at work, if he was happy. The simple questions carried the weight of decades of sacrifice, of his father's 12-hour shifts at the electronics factory, of his mother's night classes to learn English while cleaning office buildings. They had given him everything. And here he was, contemplating putting their son's financial security at risk for what David Thompson would undoubtedly call play money for tech nerds. But Marcus had seen something in Bitcoin that others couldn't or wouldn't see. Not just the technology, though that fascinated him, but the philosophy behind it. A system that didn't require permission from institutions, that couldn't be controlled by the same forces that had made his parents feel like outsiders for so many years. He remembered his father's stories about trying to get loans, about doors that closed when they heard his accent, about opportunities that somehow always went to someone who fit better with the company culture. The cursor blinked on his screen, waiting for a decision. Marcus took a deep breath, thinking about the future he wanted to build, not just for himself, but for his family. His savings account held exactly $9,000, 3 years of careful budgeting, skipped dinners out, and second-hand clothes. It represented security, the buffer his parents had taught him to maintain, but it also represented possibility. He clicked buy, investing $3,000, 1/3 of his entire net worth, into Bitcoin. As the transaction processed, Marcus felt his heart racing, a mixture of terror and exhilaration coursing through his veins. He had no idea that in a few minutes, his quiet investment would become the catalyst for months of humiliation, or that years later, it would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him in ways he never could have imagined. The team meeting on Thursday afternoon started like any other. Marcus sat in his usual spot at the far end of the mahogany conference table, legal pad in front of him, pen ready to take notes about quarterly projections and client portfolios. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room, where 12 of Sterling Financial's most senior analysts gathered weekly to discuss market trends and investment strategies. David Thompson commanded the head of the table with his usual swagger, His expensive suit perfectly tailored, his Harvard MBA diploma practically radiating authority from the wall behind him. He had been with the company for 15 years, climbing the ladder through a combination of old-school networking and an unwavering belief in traditional financial wisdom. To David, the markets were predictable, manageable, and best navigated by those who understood the rules that had governed Wall Street for generations. "So, team," David began, clicking his pen with the rhythm of someone accustomed to holding everyone's attention, "let's talk about some of the more unconventional investments our clients have been asking about lately. We've had several inquiries about cryptocurrency of all things," he chuckled, and several colleagues joined in with knowing smirks. "I want to make sure we're all on the same page about steering clients away from these speculative bubbles." Sarah Williams, one of the few female analysts in the group, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had always struck Marcus as different from the others, more thoughtful, less quick to dismiss ideas simply because they challenged conventional wisdom. Jennifer Martinez, the only other minority in the room besides Marcus, kept her eyes focused on her notebook, having learned long ago to pick her battles carefully in environments where standing out could mean being pushed out. "The fundamentals are all wrong," continued Brad Stevens, an analyst who had joined the company straight from his father's connections at Goldman Sachs. "No underlying assets, no regulatory oversight, no institutional backing. It's essentially gambling, and we'd be irresponsible to let our clients throw money away on digital fairy dust." The room erupted in approving laughter, the kind that bonds people together through shared superiority over those foolish enough to think differently. Marcus felt heat creeping up his neck. 3 days had passed since his Bitcoin purchase, and he had checked the price obsessively, watching it fluctuate between gains and losses that made his stomach churn. He had told himself he would keep quiet, that his personal investments were nobody's business, but something about the dismissive tone, the casual arrogance, the way they spoke about people who believed in cryptocurrency as if they were children playing with toy money, triggered something deep inside him. "Actually," Marcus heard himself saying, his voice quieter than he intended, "I think there might be something there worth considering." The room fell silent, with the abruptness of a record player stopping mid-song. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some curious, others already showing traces of amusement at what they clearly expected to be an entertaining moment of naivety from the quiet analyst who rarely spoke up in meetings. David's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "Oh really, Marcus? And what makes you think that?" The question carried the tone of a teacher humoring a student who had just suggested that 2 + 2 might equal 5. "Have you been doing some research into cryptocurrency investment strategies?" Marcus felt his mouth go dry, but he pushed forward. "I've been studying blockchain technology, and I actually invested some of my own money in Bitcoin last week. I think the potential for disruption in financial services could be significant." The words came out faster than he intended, as if his subconscious knew that once he started this confession, he needed to get through it quickly. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then David began to laugh, not the polite chuckle of someone acknowledging a colleague's opinion, but the deep, belly laugh of someone who had just heard the funniest joke of their career. "You actually bought Bitcoin? With real money?" The laughter spread around the table like wildfire, and suddenly Marcus found himself the center of attention in the worst possible way. The nickname started the very next morning. "Hey, crypto boy," Brad called out as Marcus walked past his desk, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "How's your imaginary money doing today?" The laughter that followed felt like needles against Marcus's skin. He had hoped the previous day's humiliation would fade with time, the way most office embarrassments eventually dissolved into forgotten memories. Instead, it had crystallized into something worse, a permanent mark of otherness in a place where he already struggled to belong. By lunch, the story had spread beyond their department. Marcus overheard conversations in the elevator, whispers in the break room. jokes traded between people who barely knew his name, but had already formed opinions about his intelligence and judgment. Someone had even created a group chat called Sterling's Crypto Corner, where they shared memes about Bitcoin crashes and screenshots of Marcus's serious expression during the previous day's meeting. Jennifer Martinez found him eating alone in the small courtyard behind the building, his brown bag lunch untouched on the concrete table beside him. The autumn air carried the smell of fallen leaves and distant traffic, a brief respite from the recycled air and artificial lighting that defined their workdays. She sat down across from him without asking, her own simple lunch reflecting the careful budgeting that came with supporting a family on a junior analyst's salary. "They're being cruel," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what it felt like to be different in a place that valued sameness above all else. "What you did took courage. Most people here are too scared to think beyond their 401k and mutual funds." She unwrapped her sandwich with deliberate care, as if the simple act of sharing lunch was itself a form of rebellion against the isolation Marcus was experiencing. Marcus looked at her gratefully, surprised by the solidarity. Jennifer had always been professional but distant, focused on her work with the intensity of someone who knew she had to be twice as good to receive half the recognition. Her support meant more than she probably realized. A reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this building, full of people who seemed to speak a language he was still learning. "I keep thinking about my parents," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They saved for years to pay for my education, worked jobs they hated so I could have opportunities they never had. And here I am, gambling with money they helped me earn." The doubt in his voice reflected weeks of sleepless nights, of checking Bitcoin's price at 3 in the morning, of wondering if his colleagues were right to question his judgment. Jennifer took a thoughtful bite of her sandwich before responding. "My grandmother used to say that the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. She came here from Mexico with nothing, started a small restaurant that everyone said would fail. The neighborhood told her that Americans would never eat authentic Mexican food, that she should serve hamburgers and French fries if she wanted to succeed." She paused, looking out at the city skyline, where construction cranes reached toward the sky like mechanical prayers. "That restaurant put 3 kids through college and bought her a house. Sometimes the people laughing are just scared of what they don't understand." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps and familiar voices approaching. David Thompson appeared around the corner with Brad and 2 other colleagues, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. When they spotted Marcus and Jennifer sitting together, David's expression shifted to something that looked almost predatory. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I hope you're not giving poor Jennifer any investment advice, crypto boy. We wouldn't want her to lose her savings on your get-rich-quick schemes." 2 years passed like a slow-motion avalanche. Marcus watched Bitcoin climb from 3,000 to 10,000, then crash to 6,000, then surge past 20,000 before falling again. Each fluctuation brought a fresh wave of commentary from his colleagues, who had turned his investment journey into office entertainment. When the price dropped, David would make exaggerated expressions of sympathy. "Oh, Marcus, I'm so sorry for your loss," he would say with theatrical concern whenever Bitcoin had a bad day. When it rose, the response was even worse. Accusations of luck, dismissals of temporary bubbles, predictions of inevitable crashes that would teach him a lesson about real investing. Marcus had learned to keep his emotions hidden, to nod politely when colleagues offered unsolicited advice about cutting his losses, to smile when they shared articles about cryptocurrency being a scam. But inside, he was building something they couldn't see. Every paycheck, he continued buying Bitcoin, dollar-cost averaging, with the discipline of someone who understood that wealth wasn't built through timing markets, but through consistent, patient accumulation. His portfolio grew quietly, steadily, like a tree taking root in hostile soil. The isolation had deepened over time. Office social events became awkward affairs, where Marcus felt like an exhibit in a museum of financial mistakes. Happy hours turned into sessions where his investment choices became the punchline to jokes he didn't find funny. Birthday celebrations in the conference room included cake and commentary about how Marcus should use his bonus to buy real assets instead of internet money. The casual cruelty was perhaps worse than outright hostility. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each small joke and dismissive comment adding to a growing wall between Marcus and the colleagues who had never accepted him as an equal. Jennifer had become his closest ally, though even she expressed concern when Bitcoin's volatility made headlines. Sarah Williams occasionally offered sympathetic smiles, but remained carefully neutral, unwilling to risk her own standing by defending someone who had marked himself as different. The rest of the office had settled into a comfortable routine of treating Marcus like a well-meaning but misguided relative who needed to be protected from his own poor judgment. David Thompson's attitude had evolved into something more sinister than mere amusement. He began excluding Marcus from high-profile projects, citing concerns about his risk assessment capabilities. Client meetings that might have advanced Marcus's career were assigned to other analysts who understood the importance of conservative financial principles. Performance reviews included subtle references to Marcus's unconventional thinking and suggestions that he might benefit from additional training in sound investment practices. Marcus's apartment became his sanctuary, a place where he could research emerging technologies without judgment, where he could watch his investment grow without having to defend his choices to people who had already decided he was wrong. His parents noticed the changes in him during their weekly phone calls, the way his voice carried less enthusiasm, how he deflected questions about work with vague responses about being busy. They worried he was working too hard, unaware that their son was fighting a different kind of battle entirely. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, when Marcus opened his portfolio app and saw a number that made him blink twice to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Bitcoin had crossed $60,000, and his patient accumulation strategy had transformed his modest investment into something that changed everything. Marcus stared at the number on his phone screen. $1.2 million. He was a millionaire, sitting in the same cramped cubicle where colleagues still called him Crypto Boy, wearing the same discount shirts from Target, eating the same brown bag lunches his mother had taught him to pack. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had achieved more financial success than most of his tormentors, while they continued treating him like a naive child playing with toy money. The contrast became more stark with each passing day. While Marcus quietly managed a 7-figure portfolio, David Thompson complained loudly about his mortgage payments and the cost of his daughter's private school tuition. Brad Stevens mentioned maxing out credit cards during a particularly expensive vacation, laughing it off as living life, while simultaneously lecturing Marcus about financial responsibility. The same people who had mocked his investment acumen were struggling with basic money management. Though none of them seemed aware of the irony, Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't reveal his success without fundamentally altering every relationship in the office, yet keeping the secret felt like living a double life. He maintained his modest lifestyle, driving the same used Honda, wearing the same rotation of shirts, eating the same simple lunches, while his investment continued growing with each passing week. The discipline that had made him successful also made him invisible, exactly what he needed to avoid unwanted attention, but exactly what made the daily humiliations harder to bear. Sarah Williams had begun showing more interest in cryptocurrency, asking Marcus careful questions during coffee breaks when others weren't around. She had noticed the strange calm that had settled over him, the way he no longer flinched when people made jokes about his investments. There was something different in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that suggested he knew something they didn't. Her curiosity was genuine, born from watching someone she respected maintain conviction despite constant ridicule. Jennifer had started bringing her own investment questions to Marcus during their courtyard lunches, recognizing that his research went far deeper than anyone gave him credit for. She had watched him weather the storm of office politics with grace, had seen him continue studying market trends while others relied on outdated conventional wisdom. Her trust in his judgment had grown as she witnessed his commitment to learning and his refusal to be swayed by popular opinion. The tipping point came during a particularly brutal office happy hour at the downtown sports bar they frequented after quarterly meetings. David, loosened by 3 beers and emboldened by the crowd's energy, had launched into his most aggressive attack yet on Marcus's financial choices. "I mean, seriously, Marcus," he proclaimed to the assembled group, "when are you going to admit this whole Bitcoin thing was a mistake and start investing like a grown-up?" The laughter that followed was meaner than usual, fed by alcohol and the pack mentality that turned decent people into casual bullies. Marcus sat quietly, sipping his single beer, watching faces he had once hoped to call friends as they joined in the mockery. He thought about his parents, about the sacrifices they had made, about the quiet dignity with which they had faced years of similar treatment. He thought about the number on his phone screen, about the financial freedom that meant he never had to endure this again if he chose not to. But mostly, he thought about the lessons his grandmother had taught him about patience, about letting actions speak louder than words, about the power that came from knowing your own worth regardless of what others believed about you. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday evening in October 2023. Marcus was reading research papers about blockchain applications when his personal phone buzzed with a number he recognized but had never seen calling him directly. David Thompson's voice on the other end sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence and authority that had defined their every interaction for 6 years. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I know I don't have the right to ask." The words came slowly, each one seeming to cost David something precious. Marcus could hear traffic in the background, suggesting David was calling from his car, probably sitting in some parking lot where nobody could witness this moment of vulnerability. "I'm in trouble, financially. The divorce, the legal fees, some bad investments I made trying to recover. I'm about to lose my house." Marcus said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge David would have to choose to cross. He thought about all the meetings where David had dismissed his ideas, all the projects he had been excluded from, all the casual cruelties disguised as professional guidance. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and they both knew it. Marcus held his former tormentor's financial future in his hands, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any portfolio balance. "I know what you're thinking," David continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Why would you help someone who treated you the way I did? And you'd be right to say no. But I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anywhere else to turn. My daughter starts college next year, and if I lose the house—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus could hear the desperation that filled the silence. The old Marcus might have felt satisfaction at hearing David's suffering. The man who had made his life miserable was finally facing consequences for his arrogance and cruelty. But as Marcus sat in his modest apartment, looking at investment statements that showed wealth beyond David's imagination, he felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but a deep sadness for how much pain could have been avoided if people simply chose kindness over superiority. "How much do you need?" Marcus asked quietly. The question seemed to catch David off guard, as if he had prepared for rejection but not for immediate practical discussion. When David named the figure, $60,000 to save his house and cover his daughter's first year of college, Marcus realized it represented less than 5% of his Bitcoin holdings. The same investment that David had mocked as worthless could now solve problems that seemed insurmountable to the man who had once held authority over Marcus's career. "I can transfer the money tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "No interest, no timeline for repayment. Just help your daughter get her education and maybe—" Maybe try to remember what it feels like to need help from someone you've underestimated. The silence that followed was different from the hostile quiet of those old meetings. This silence held possibility, redemption, and the recognition that true strength sometimes meant extending grace to those who had never extended it to you. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus, I don't know what to say. After everything why would you do this?" Marcus looked out his apartment window at the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, thinking about his parents' stories of kindness received from strangers when they had nothing, about the cycle of compassion that his grandmother had taught him was stronger than any cycle of revenge. "Because someone has to break the pattern," Marcus replied. "And maybe it's time to show people that there's more than one way to build wealth and more than one way to use it."